So George is a transgender man, a Catholic teacher of RE, and a freelance consultant in LGBT plus inclusive education. In the seminar, we will explore the following legal requirements of UK schools and the new government guidance for gender questioning children. Teachings of the Catholic Church and the Catechism and other Vatican documents, practical examples for moving forward, considering the two previous sessions. So I'd like us to give a very warm welcome to George.
Okay, unfortunately it will be a lot of me talking. It's a whistle-stop tour essentially, but I'd normally have a little bit longer to kind of deliver this. So I'm going to try and go through it as quickly as possible, but I have given out business cards. There are some more at the front, so please get in touch if you want to know anything else. Oh, it's already stopped working. That's fine though, because I'm here. So the starting point for schools is the Equality Act. The Equality Act is legislation, has been since 2010, and it talks about the protected characteristics. So I'm going to focus a little bit on gender reassignment, on religion, belief, and on sexual orientation and how they interlink and how they might be seen as kind of controversial in some. But it is important to know that whether you are a member of staff or you are a student, that you are protected under the Equality Act. Obviously, I'm assuming we've all kind of read the Keeping Children Safe in Education. Being LGBT is not necessarily a safeguarding risk in itself, but there are additional safeguarding concerns that we need to be aware of as educators. I'm going to spend a little bit of time on the characteristic of gender reassignment. This is trans people like myself. This is the one that often causes the most confusion. I'm going to read what it says on the board, but you have to bear with me because I have to pause dramatically, mainly because I'm asthmatic and it's a long sentence. So a person has the protected characteristic of gender reassignment if the person is proposing to undergo, is undergoing or has undergone a process or part of a process for the purpose of reassigning the person's sex by changing physiological or other attributes of sex. That's lengthy. What it essentially means is from the moment that someone comes out as trans, that they are protected under that characteristic, whether they've changed their name, whether they've started hormones, whether they're halfway through, partway through, whether they're the full way through, whatever it might be. So, in terms of schools, you are, as I said, you are protected from that characteristic of gender reassignment from the moment that you come out as trans. Okay, so you don't have to have undergone any specific kind of treatment or to have had an official diagnosis. But in law already, so if you are a single-sex school, you are by law you are allowed to turn away an application of someone of the opposite biological sex from your school. So there are some scenarios in which protecting the single-sex spaces is perfectly legal, and that's fine. So this is perhaps where some of the things are a little bit more difficult kind of to navigate in school. Some things are very concrete in law, and some things are kind of left up to our imagination a little bit. So it's unlawful to victimise directly or indirectly anyone who has a protected characteristic. So for example, if you were to treat the bullying of a trans pupil not the same as you would if there was some racist bullying, sexist, then you could be guilty of unlawful discrimination. You must be very clear, and I'll come on to kind of what your policy should look like in a short while. The reason that I'm delivering this talk, I appreciate that it's quite small for you there, but that essentially the number of trans people coming out has gone up since kind of 2010. It's been on a steady increase, slightly decreased towards 2021, but we're looking at about 2,500 referrals of young people a year, and the most likely age that someone is going to come out is kind of around the teenage years when they are starting puberty. So those of you in secondary school, you might see it more frequently than those in primary school. The reason that I bring that up is because the waiting times for people once they are referred, so once their GP refers them to a gender identity clinic, once they refer them to that, there is nothing else additionally offered in terms of support. So you don't get a letter that says your referral has been collected, you don't get offered any counselling, and the likelihood is you're going to be waiting between 3 and 4 years, maybe even longer. that means that that young person in your care, where they spend 8 or 9 hours a day, is likely to need some help and support, and they're not being offered it elsewhere. So it's just important to note that really if someone does come out as trans, the likelihood is that they might feel quite alone for a significant period of time. In terms of things to look out for, the phrase that you might hear is gender dysphoria. So gender dysphoria is the misalignment between your biological sex and the feelings that you have about your gender identity. So for me, I have this really weird thing. So if the hair on the side of my face gets fluffy and it grows out a bit, I get really dysphoric about that. I feel like I look female, and that upsets me. That will be different for all young people. They will have different ways of expressing certain things. So you may notice that people are wearing modifications. So for trans men, so like myself, female then to male, you might be wearing a chest binder. You shouldn't be doing exercise in that. You shouldn't be kind of wearing it when wet, and it shouldn't be worn for more than 8 hours. So it's important, I think, to recognise that you may notice that for some people there is something going on. So just keeping a sign out for those types of things. Are they presenting themselves in a different way? We very often have someone that you know, we had people that came in with it with like a severely drastic haircut compared to what they had previously. So it's just again looking out for those things. It doesn't indicate they are going to transition, but it might indicate that there's something going on that you need to have a conversation with them about. In terms of legal side now, so in terms of looking at the legality of the stuff that we're talking about, I would always recommend talking to lawyers if in your school you're not sure about something. Brown Jacobson offer a really good service. There's also somewhere, I think it's near Bristol, called Stone King. So there's a couple of places to look out for. But in terms of what we include in information, we should be providing all points of view, or both points of view. So in terms of the freedom of thought, belief and religion, in the Human Rights article from 1998, we should be providing a kind of wide variety of views. That doesn't mean, so I'm a teacher of RE, it doesn't mean that whenever I mention creationism, so the idea that the world was created in 7 days, that I need to say, but do bear in mind this is what Catholics believe and this is what atheists believe. It doesn't mean you have to do it at the same time, but that you should be, when teaching something, teaching it in its whole complexity. So for example, you may use some of the resources kind of on the board here. What I would suggest is when you are looking through things, are these resources likely to be fairly neutral? Are they likely to make people feel that they are not welcome there? So I would say you've got to exercise professional caution in those situations. Okay, statutory guidance for all schools, whether you're primary or secondary. You should be able to provide an environment where you are challenging stereotypes, and that this is something that's being done through primary and secondary. In particular, in secondary, there should be some kind of concept of sexuality, of sexual health, of the idea of gender identity, and the ideas of these that are developing. That is part of the Catholic Education Service framework as well. I appreciate this is really quick, so I'm sorry. You will have seen that the government released, was it the day before the Christmas holiday? The day before the Christmas holiday, something like that. They released their guidance on gender questioning children. It states these 5 things here are the main kind of purpose of it. So schools and colleges have statutory duties to safeguard and promote the welfare of all children. Yep. Schools and colleges should be respectful and tolerant places where bullying is never tolerated. Yep. Parents should not be excluded from decisions taken by a school or college relating to requests for a child to socially transition. Okay, that may come into breach of the first one if it is a serious safeguarding incident. Schools and colleges have specific legal duties that are framed by a child's biological sex, and there is no general duty to allow a child to socially transition. So this guidance is in consultation until March the 12th, which is next week on Tuesday, I believe. I would recommend, there are links within this slide, I would recommend reading it in its entirety, and I would recommend reading some of the responses in their entirety as well. There are links to that in this presentation. So in addition, some of the things then that it says in there, that the view of parents is important and it should carry great weight and be properly considered. They would expect parental consent to be required in the vast majority of cases. Single-sex schools can refuse to admit pupils of other biological sex, and that's already enshrined in law, that's already fine. Agreeing to a child's request to have others use different pronouns about them is significant, and the government guidance suggests that primary school children should not have different pronouns to their sex-based pronouns. Schools may have different uniform requirements, some which specify uniform items for girls and some are for boys. If a child is gender questioning, so if, for example, I was at school as a female pupil and transitioning to male and I started to wear trousers, it does suggest here that in general that I should be held to the same uniform standards as people of my biological sex, okay, which obviously is likely to cause some harm. And in all cases, bullying of any child must not be tolerated, and no child should be sanctioned for honest mistakes when adapting to a new way of interacting with another pupil. Okay, again, looking at what an honest mistake is, can it be an honest mistake if it's happened 5 or 6 times? You know, is there a strategy for what we're dealing with here in school? Robin Moira White is a barrister who has written an extensive piece of feedback on that. Again, the link is attached on the next slide. The guidance has been suggested by the Department for Education's own lawyers as being likely to result in a high successful chance of a legal challenge. So, for example, the idea of wakeful watching, which it says that when a child requests to come out, we should have a period of wakeful watching to see if that's actually what they want. That does go against what it suggests in the Equality Act, but also because they've put no time frame on it. Watchful waiting for how long? That there's no general duty to allow a child to socially transition. Once a child comes out to you in law, they are protected by that characteristic of gender reassignment. Okay, and then is there any reason in particular that primary school age students can't? Why have we created the separation there? Biological sex toilets need to be available from the ages of 8, so you need to have separate biological spaces, but we talk about Gillick competence at the age of 12 or 13, so there's a bit of disparity there about why that's there. So the attachment is here. So Robin Moira White has done a commentary where she's detailed those things. I would invite you to have a look at both of those things in full detail. And then there's a link for how you would respond to that before March the 12th. But she says that we need a guidance which is born of love, inclusion and support, not exclusion, hatred and nastiness. In terms then of Ofsted, so I've had schools reach out to me who have had an Ofsted inspection and it's not gone well. They've been downgraded because they've been asked the question, what does LGBT inclusion look like in your school? And they haven't got anything that they can say. Nothing in curriculum, nothing in policies, nothing in behaviour and culture of the school. So it's important to note that when Ofsted do come, they will be looking at how you set out your duties like the Equality Act and the Human Rights Act within your curriculum. In terms of creating an inclusive culture, one of the things that we did, and it took a while, we're probably maybe 2 or 3 years in at my school, is inviting young people to participate and to lead on these things. Do pupil voice, find out what I asked the students last time we hosted some particular kind of diversity work. Do they feel included? Do they feel safe? And if not, then we start to look at what we can do instead. So speak to your young people. There will be differences in what's happening around all the schools that you are in. Okay, I'm going to pause for a second and go on to the next section. The next section we're going to explore some of the church teaching, but I would recommend that those of you that are in here, presuming most of you teach RE, that it is reasonable to go and talk to your school leaders first. Don't just assume that these things can happen and will happen overnight. So do speak to your SLT, do speak maybe if necessary to your CMAT, or if you need to go further, it may be worth having a conversation with your Director of Education or Bishop. So, for the Catholic Church, sex and gender are inseparable, okay? So there's a kind of common assumption that trans people assume that they're both entirely different when the Catholic Church writes about trans people, but it doesn't ask them. But sex and gender are inexplicably linked and cannot be completely separated. So though you might present yourself in a slightly, non-traditional way, it can't be removed from your biological sex and your purpose for your biological sex either. None of this will come as news to you in the Catechism, but it says that LGBT people, well, in fact, the Catechism only actually talks about, it describes them as homosexual relationships in the Catechism as the language used. But it says that relations between men or between women, of another relationship with a person of the same sex, we've got the kind of idea that the acts of that are acts of grave depravity, is language that is used in the Catechism. There are people trying to fight for that to be changed. You may find that might make students feel awkward, angry, whatever it might be, so it's good to approach these with some sensitivity. But there is a line, 2358 in the Catechism, which says, and this is talking of those it describes here with their homosexual condition, that they must not be separated with, they must be accepted with respect, compassion and sensitivity. Accepted means accepting what someone is telling you about their identity. Okay, respect, compassion and sensitivity, and every sign of unjust discrimination in their regard should be avoided. So I would suggest that really, when you're in school, by talking about these things and allowing proper space to explore church teaching and other things, you are able then to decipher what might be considered just discrimination by the church and what might be considered unjust discrimination. You may or may not be aware that there was a Vatican document released in 2019 called Male and Female, He Created Them, which essentially summarises that the desire to remove or ignore sexual differences and the complementarity of males and females is dangerous, that identity is not the choice of the individual but a gift from God, that gender and sex are inexplicably linked, and that gender ideology, which they define as the belief that we can change gender, is dangerous and should not be encouraged in schools or education. That sits in direct opposition with UK law, which we have to follow as a precedent. Okay. What's changed in the church? Not much. And I didn't mean that to be funny. Not much. It's not much. But we have seen a difference in attitude since Pope Francis started, 10 years ago. He's the first pope to use the word gay. He described, I think, a trans man once as he that was a she but is now a he, and is using the language that those people use of themselves. So, when we use the word homosexuality, many students might feel it's outdated and we're not understanding exactly what it is that we're talking about. He's explicitly accompanied LGBT people in pastoral ministry. He's commended in public figures like Sister Jeanine Gramick, Father James Martin, who are doing lots of really great work for the LGBT community. And he's advocated kind of for you'll have seen recently the blessing of same-sex couples, for the legal support of those who are in a same-sex union, that their family should be protected legally. So this is just a little side note, really, but the Pope, in terms of a couple of bits of teaching that are specifically about trans people, and I'm sure more will come in the future. In the year 2000, there was a document released in secrecy that was to be used kind of case-by-case basis, that suggests that trans people are not permitted to have their sex changed on their baptismal certificate, to get married, to be ordained, or to join a religious order. Okay, none of those things really are taking place in schools, but Pope Francis has recently kind of come out and said that actually trans people can be baptised in the church and be godparents. There's a little bit underneath there that says, unless it creates a public scandal. Again, there's no real definition of what's meant by that, but it is a change in attitude to what we've seen previously. What does respect, compassion and sensitivity look like? Well, there are plenty of stories. It's great because I do actually have to update this every now and then because there are more stories coming forward. Very early in his papacy, Pope Francis was asked on the plane to Lampedusa, I think it was. He was asked, what about gay priests? Because it says kind of in official teaching, if you have deep-seated homosexual tendencies, that you can't be a priest. But the priests are asked to be celibate, as are gay people, so that didn't make much sense. But then Pope Francis kind of said, who am I to judge gay people? Which I remember, it was like shocking at the time. It was like a landmark kind of event. but allows priests to bless same-sex couples is something that's come up kind of recently. If you come up and it's spontaneous, that you can have a blessing as two people coming up together. He helped this couple on the left-hand side. So they are Catholic, gay, and they adopted 3 children, and in their local kind of parishes they were struggling to find anyone to baptise their children. So they got a phone call from Pope Francis, and Pope Francis ran around and said, and helped get the children baptised. Again, in terms of trans people, okay, we can see certain things. I probably could update this one more recently, but the Pope has invited the trans community that he ate with. I don't know if you saw it a couple of weeks ago. He ate with a group of trans women out in the street. They were eating pizza, I think, which is probably, I might have made that up, I don't know. But they were eating together in the street, in public. He's said that he's kind of pastorally accompanied trans people, and he has advocated kind of for that pastoral ministry within the church. This is where it gets kind of tricky, and you may, I don't know how nerdy you all are, but like, I obviously get like an email every time something Catholic happens. So in 2008, Pope Benedict suggested that there is a need to save mankind from the destructing blurring of gender roles, so this kind of idea that males and females can do anything that the other one can do, and that is as important as saving the rainforests. In 2021, the United States Catholic Bishops' Conference banned any investment into a hospital which provided transgender healthcare. So not just for the trans people, but anyone in that hospital, they would not give any money to that. And this is where I'm doing the nerdy bit. So Pope Francis said yesterday that one of the kind of ugliest things that's happening at the moment in our society is this belief that we can blur or destruct gender roles. Trans people make up something like 0.5% of the population in the UK, something like 2% worldwide. I'd argue that climate change, the kind of saving of the rainforests is possibly a little bit more of a problem. But you never know. I suppose this is a little bit tongue-in-cheek really, but the idea essentially, Pope Francis is very clear when he's writing in he's not changing any church teaching here. He's very clear about the importance of male and female, and he's very clear on that in Amoris Laetitia, where you'd expect it because it's about kind of family life. Even also in Laudato Si, which it's about kind of caring for the environment, but it comes across in everything, it comes through. But St. Joan of Arc was banned at the stake for dressing like a man. That's oversimplifying it. But she's still a saint. So maybe one day. Yes. This is a great resource, especially if you teach Spanish, because you would have to watch it with subtitles otherwise. It came out in April last year. It's on Disney, which I've actually learned is illegal to stream in schools, so be warned. The Pope says, so the Pope, it's called The Pope Answers, and there's a series of maybe 10 questions, something like that, that these young people ask the Pope, and a non-binary young person gets up and asks the Pope, do you know what non-binary means? And he says, yes, I do. And the non-binary young person explains it anyway, which is quite handy for anyone watching that doesn't know. And then the young person says, what would you do what would you say to those people who use the Bible as a form of hate speech to say that I am not welcome here? And Pope Francis says that all persons are children of God, that he has no right to expel anyone from the church because God does not reject anybody. And he says that these people are infiltrators who take advantage of the church for their personal passions, for their personal narrowness. He says it's one of the corruptions of the church. So in some way that might sit in kind of conflict with the comments that he came out with yesterday. There's also the concept of primacy of conscience, which we kind of get from Vatican II, this idea that there is stuff that is holy and true in other people's belief systems. And essentially as teachers, we have a duty to educate the conscience. We do that by showing all points of view, by teaching what the Catholic Church says, and by showing that what the world looks like. And that essentially, within reason, if you are educating your conscience and you decide that something is appropriate for you to do, that this does take kind of precedence over other things within church teaching. Okay, I appreciate that's really quick as well. So, I'm going to go into how we move forward, because I think that's probably the main bit for what we do. That's your justification for doing it though. So, how do we move forward? You may have read the Instrumentum Laboris that came out of the first synod session in October last year. It asks for the first time. They've actually got a fancier acronym than I have. So the Catholic Church is ahead of me at the minute. It says, how can we create spaces where those who feel hurt by the church and are welcomed by the community feel recognised, received, free to ask questions and not judged? Okay, and then blah, 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 and then in brackets, LGBTQ plus people. So how do we create safe spaces for them? Well, as you'll all be aware, you are assessed in 3 ways in your CSI inspection. So through your Catholic life and mission, through your religious education, and through your worship. So I'm going to try and show you a couple of examples that you might be able to use for each of those as you go through. You will have seen in the new RED that there is a section, one of the first kind of obvious things in Year 7, Unit 3, that there is a mention of Father Michael Judge, who was an openly gay priest who lost his life in 9/11 as a chaplain to the fire department. There are other sections where you can have a look at kind of the marginalisation of groups through what we might describe as structures of sin. We've got concepts of human dignity, we've got concepts of justice and peace, so we can look at the decriminalisation of LGBT people and their relationships around the world. The Pope appeared in a video clip in January last year, again I don't know how many of you have seen it, where he said there's something like 50 countries in the world where you can be at best put in prison and at worst put to death because you're LGBTQ essentially, and he said that we as a church must stop that. So supporting those things contributes to the Catholic life and mission of your school. This is probably the easiest one, but it's also one that often people find the most controversial. So having kind of visuals and resources. So I wear on my staff lanyard the 2 badges at the top. So one is just a little pride rainbow with a cross, and another is a trans flag with a cross. I started to wear it as a sign of being, out and proud, but other staff noticed me wearing it and have had pupils speak to them. They've asked to wear them as well, so it's widespread. Having LGBT people in your visuals, in your photos, in other things like that I know you obviously can't just tell what people look, how people look is their identity, but having someone, I appear in stuff in my school that makes it clear that they are not ashamed that I work there, and that's just a little sign that for an LGBT person that they are accepted and welcome there. There's a great set of resources from Stonewall. Again, they're attached in the links of this slide. There's a couple of books. So Building a Bridge by James Martin, which is that kind of relationship building book between Catholic communities and the LGBT community. The Book of Queer Prophets, which is compiled by Ruth Hunt, who I believe is a Catholic. And then Sister Janine Gramick has put together some stories of lesbian and queer religious. So there are plenty of resources you might want to put down in your library. Yeah. I created a set of posters, and I'm happy to send them out, about human dignity, and it explores kind of all aspects of human dignity so that people recognise themselves in what we are talking about. So they've got people of colour, people who are neurodivergent, people with a disability. We have these on display in our school, around the building. What I would suggest is if you are creating resources, you need to be able to connect them back to core principles of Catholicism, core principles of Catholic social teaching, for example. So human dignity, participation, solidarity, things like that. In terms of your teaching, so if you can, I know it's hard, but try and avoid using phrases like boys and girls, ladies and gentlemen. You may just be putting someone into a category they don't feel comfortable in, and that it may seem like, it may be one child you teach, it may be no children you teach, but it will stick out to the person if they do feel that they are being put into a group that they don't associate with. So they, them, Year 9, any other, someone was coming up with some really fancy ones, so anything you want in a classroom, but when you are teaching as well, so I think this is lazy behaviour management, and I'm really sorry if you do it, but putting people in a boy-girl seating plan just because they'll be quiet, they won't, and you might be putting someone in a category that they just don't feel comfortable, so try and avoid that if you can. Inviting people in is often quite a nice thing. So I do visit schools and teach them about what the Catholic Church says, and I talk to students. And yes, you will get the awkward question, and as staff in a school, you'll feel like, oh my God, the poor visitor will be fine, because after a few questions, young people just start to realise you're just another ordinary person, and no longer what toilets do you use, but have you got a dog, anything like that. 1010, in terms of your relationships and sex education, you may or may not use that. It does claim to be inclusive, and it does speak about gender identity and sexual orientation, but often with a caveat that most people, I think most people teaching RE might recognise. So there's one where they talk of someone who is experiencing same-sex attraction, and then they say, oh, but she thought about it a bit longer and it turns out she just admired her. That can be diminishing to young people. There's the kind of idea, there's one that's talking about gender identity, and it says, I prayed for healing and I was healed, and then it ends. So we were like, healed how? So just be conscious that some of those resources might, although they don't intend to, they might diminish the thoughts of people in your classroom. You are required by the Catholic Education Service, if you have a look at their documents, that Key Stage 3 and 4 pupils in particular should be aware of sexual identity, gender identity, sexual orientation. They should be able to label what counts as discrimination, prejudice and bullying. They should have a concept that there is a diversity in sexual attraction. They should know about types of marriage outside church marriage, and they should know about the kind of concept that sexuality could develop at times, okay? I do this, and this was something that took a bit of work in my school, but I stick my pronouns in my email signature. I also have a resource stuck to the bottom, but you may find that when you have a student who is transitioning, that some of these things make them feel a bit more comfortable in terms of coming out. You will see that I had a drastic haircut. Okay, if I was in school, I'd have been on CPOMs. Probably, well, for more than that. But so checking in. So when I went back to the doctors I attended as a child, and they had a picture of me, and I was a girl in it, and my nurse just said, "Do you want me to just get rid of that?" And I was like, "Yeah, okay," because they'll also be like, "Who is this man coming for this young..." But just making those changes can make people feel more accepted. We, for example, have lots of students at the age of 12 or 13 that start to wear a headscarf. So I just very simply will quietly have a word with them and say, do you want a new photo taking so it represents who you are, showing the outside world you are? It is important to note that you can't change someone's legal name unless they have legally had it changed. But your ARBA, like your registered systems, we use ARBA, so you should have the ability to put a preferred name on there. Mine actually says that my sex is male, which legally it's not. That's not a problem, is it? I've said it on camera now, so. But you now have the option of putting gender identity in there. You can also have the option, if this young person doesn't want everyone to know, that staff that teach them are aware, or staff that need to know are aware. But there are spaces for you to add a preferred name and a gender identity on most register systems. Made in God's Image is a great resource from the Catholic Education Service. 2016, I want to say, maybe later, 2018, I think actually. I would try, if at all possible, when you are looking at your school policies, I would try and make sure that your policies are gender neutral. So the language you use around uniform, around makeup, and even your staff dress codes, that they are as gender neutral as is possible. That your behaviour policy is very, very clear, okay? So this document helps us to understand, completely why homophobia, biphobia, transphobia are completely unacceptable in school, but your behaviour policy needs to reflect that. I had children say stuff to me when I first started my job that was not dealt with in the same way as other discriminatory behaviour, and it can make you feel horrific. Making sure your inclusion policy is up to date, so there are loads of organisations that help you with that. Equality, you can have a look at. I've got some policies attached to the bottom here as well if you want to have a look at those. But I'd make sure that that's visibly on display. Put this at the forefront of what you do as a school. When you hand out your safeguarding leaflet to a visitor, have your inclusion statement on the back of it so that everyone knows that you are welcoming to everybody. And then, of course, following usual safeguarding policies if someone discloses something to you. In our school, we have revised our behaviour system so that any negative behaviour, if, for example, someone said something, whether they meant it in a horrible way or they just don't know, we would sanction them with maybe an hour after school detention. But if they didn't know, we do this all the time now really, we would have a conversation with that young person to explain why what they're saying is not acceptable in our school. So religion cannot be used as an excuse to discriminate against somebody for their sexual orientation or their gender identity. So we would have a conversation with them. If they were to repeat that behaviour, it's a straight exclusion at our school. So if they repeat it once, it's a C5. That's what ours is, a consequence 5. And we would record those things so we can keep up to date with them. We record those through CPOMs as well, which I recommend doing. In terms of prayer and worship, there are things that you can do. So marking special days of importance in a school chapel. In our diocese on November the 20th, the year before, we hosted a special mass to pray for transgender people who had died by suicide or because they'd been killed for their identity. And marking days like that, praying for the dead is a requirement of the church. We're not kind of promoting anything there that we shouldn't be. We are suggesting that all this unjust discrimination should be avoided, which is church teaching. I think these diocesan resources which came out of the synod are really good and the young people respond to them really well. So who are the people who feel left out and excluded in the church? You will find that the young people will say a plethora of things you weren't necessarily expecting, but give them the power to lead on making that change in your school as well. This is an example of a prayer that we use. I've actually adapted it this morning, like any good teacher. So we've got a bit of scripture in, and we've got a prayer that essentially just speaks kind of the language of the catechism about accepting people for their identity and removing unjust discrimination. Someone pointed out to me, I was at another conference which wasn't specifically Catholic, so I used Loving Father, and they were saying that, because we have a recognition that God isn't male, do we have an alternative in the Catholic Church? And I was like, no, because they use all sorts of terminology, and so I just changed it for God. That might make a difference, might not, but just an interesting one to do. I promise I'm nearly finished for questions. Off timetable activities, this is the thing I would say that's changed the culture in my school the most, and it's enabled young people to feel empowered. We have something now called Diversity Weeks, where we host visitors. This week we had Fran Marshall, a photographer from London, who has created a queer religion series. I'll pop the link out to that. A queer religion series where she's taken photos of Catholics, Christians, Muslim and Jewish leaders, and they've all provided a quote, and she's spoken about the importance of her work. We've had G.A. Macaulay, who was on BBC's Too Gay for God, lesbian author Sarah Hager-Holt, who was brought up, she worked at CAFOD, I think, yeah. So we have lots of people, but in terms of human rights, in the Human Rights Act, we've also had interviews. There were video interviews because these people couldn't join us in person, with celibate lesbian and gay Christians. So we've provided a range of points of view for our young people to see. This was one of the things that led our students to creating a diversity committee. You're going to find that you're probably not likely to set up a pride club anywhere. I personally, I would suggest that they're not necessary. I think a diversity group is better, because I think when we don't need to isolate. We need to make sure that we all feel kind of included and that we're all learning about one another. So that's always a good way to get young people involved. You will have seen this. Many teachers of RE, you may find yourselves in interviews. Many teachers of RE that I've spoken to were asked the question, so even in my department, so someone 22 years ago and someone 2 years ago were asked, how would you respond if a child asks for your view on homosexuality? And I know there isn't a rule book, but we're all expected to say, I would say what the Catholic Church teaches. And we would. But are we teaching about conscience? Are we able to talk about pastoral examples of ministry? Are we asking that question about any other controversial area in the church? Are we asking, how would you respond if a child asks for your views about divorced and remarried Catholics receiving communion? We're probably not. So do we need to ask it in this scenario? Yeah. This is close now. So there is a video interview. The link that was in my email pro now. I don't imagine anyone has ever clicked on it and gone to watch it because it is an hour and a half. I did an interview with Quest, on behalf of Quest, really, with Father James Martin, who's been commended by the Pope. And essentially, this is what he said, summarised in an hour and a half. So, listen to the experiences of LGBT people, invite people in to share their stories, respect the language that they use about themselves, walk with them on the journey and celebrate with them. So you're doing things like focusing on human dignity, Trans Day of Remembrance, making sure that LGBT people are visible and supported within your community, and then advocating for universal LGBT rights. So use resources that talk about the death penalty for being LGBT. Start to make young people aware of those things and challenge those concepts. So, as far as possible, I would suggest that the best thing to do, you've all done this top one now, so well done. Remove fear by educating staff or booking training with legal and faith requirements. As I said, there are some really good places that are doing lots of work on that. So Brown Jacobson or Stone King, you might choose to get in touch with. Find allies and staff that can help further this. It can feel very lonely and tiresome if you're doing it on your own. Have someone come and tell their story. It means it's personal, it gives students an opportunity to ask questions, and it stops being just another checkbox activity. Be very clear in your written word and policy, clear and firm. Include LGBT content all year round, not just in June or February when it's LGBT History Month, but relate anything back to core principles of Catholicism. And I know that RE teachers have to polarise sometimes in terms of asking, should gay people be allowed to get married in the church? But I would try and have more sensitive discussions leading up to that first, so you're not immediately just polarising the points of view of people in the room. That's it. And I finished on time. And now if there are any questions. Hello.
So the second part of the talk didn't mention as much about how we should do as teachers with parents who have maybe quite conservative or anti-LGBT views, and how we can support students who have parents that hold such views. I was just wondering what your advice might be to teachers.
Yeah, that is it's a really complex one, and we've had the same in our school. And essentially, what we talk about is the importance of that the child is the person at the heart of this decision, and the child is the most important person that we need to keep safe. So we would suggest working with parents for as far as you can. Some of the things that we've done, so if a child maybe was visible in a talk that they didn't want their parents to know, then we might kind of remove the photo, but parents can ring us and talk to us about any problems they might have. We would also just suggest that really what we will do is, we had a young person email the school office and say, I'm going from female to male, I want to come out. But the parents were really, really unsupportive. So we just said, at school, our duty is to keep this young person safe. We will call them what they've chosen to be called at school, but let's not attribute a pronoun to them straight away then, because they weren't ready to make that choice anyway. So we used the name of the pupil, and we just said to the parent, when we are talking to you about them, we're going to use the name that they've chosen. If they were still funny, which they were at first, we just said, right, well, we'll say your child, or they, for now. But it's often a process, and you'll find that it can. I was in a school that it took something like 4 years to get this process kind of right for them allowed to do it. You might find, I doubt it, but you might find parents that talk about their legal rights over the children, but there is also the United the Constitution of Human Rights of Children, which is also important. So it's a journey, and it's not going to be easy, but I would keep them in the loop. I would also pass over to I would pass over to the DSL in those scenarios, so that they take the brief on that.
No.
Oh, sorry if anyone's a DSL. There's only 1 minute left, so.
Can I ask you, from your personal experience, you're obviously really committed Catholic, what kept you in the church, maybe? Your experiences, maybe historically?
So when I first came out, I'm so sorry if this is going to run over, but when I first came out, I was terrified. I was like, I'm gonna lose my job. I'm not going to be able to work in a Catholic school anymore. I won't be able to go to my friend's house. You know, my whole world was a little bit Catholic, and I was like, it's going to die. It's going to go. And I was just kind of overwhelmed by the kind of support of people. You know, there was a lot of people that just kind of. My faith for me is very action based, and I teach at the school I went to as a secondary school student, and I was baptised in that chapel at the age of 16 in my school because of the commitment that teachers made to me. So I see my work as prayer, and that's what keeps me there, because I see the difference it makes.